Wali Fellow at Harvard University. He is also currently holding several professorial fellow positions at Cambridge and Oxford universities and has been accorded many prestigious scholarly awards from several institutions, including the World Bank. In 2017, he was awarded the rare Distinguished Professor of Economics position by the Ministry of Higher Education. Professor Raja, I would like to welcome you to this event and thank you for finding time from your busy schedule to accommodate us today. After 2 years of global pandemic having a very unprecedented effect on the global economy, we thought at last we were seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with the worldwide vaccination and immunization program being undertaken. However, quite unexpectedly, just as we are entering the endemic phase, we have a war at hand throwing challenges to this recovery. I understand that you have been doing a few rounds of discussions and presentations on this, Professor, and I hope that you can share some of your learned views and insights on this issue with us. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite you, Professor, to begin your presentation. In the meantime, I would just appreciate if everybody could just mute your mic and we will leave the question and answers at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Please proceed, Professor.
Thank you, Madam Sharida, for this glowing presentation account to me. Coming in the wake of the pandemic, I'm sure we can't possibly address the Russia-Ukraine war without some sort of knowledge about what's happening to our pandemic. Now, some people have this notion that you can actually trigger a recovery once you see the bottom. Unlike, say, the global financial crisis that we faced, emanating from the US in 2007, reaching here in 2008, over 2 years, there you can see a bottom emerging because you know what to look for, you've seen the bottom, and therefore you can have fiscal stimulus to stimulate the economy back. But this is not the same with the pandemic. The last time we had this was in 1918, which used to be known as the Spanish flu. It's about 100 years since that we have the same situation where we don't really know whether the mutations that have come about, I think they probably had 4 mutations by now, each one of them leading to a surge in infections as well as in deaths. Now, because of that uncertainty, economists are good at predicting something when you're quite certain about what's going to happen. Now, we don't have that sort of situation, except that there is this feeling that unless you do something to prevent lockdowns, unless you do something, the x-axis involved here, that is the economy, would just go down, and you may have a bottomless fall, the free fall that Stiglitz talked about when the global economic crisis struck, except that the US, as I mentioned, being a financial crisis, they were able to print money and do everything possible to revive the economy back. Now we have a situation where the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak actually started officially that we knew from February 2020, although our own MCO started from March, and the surges accompanying the virus mutations. The shift to endemic from pandemic, but before a clear pattern or sign that shows the scientific evidence that the pandemic is bottomed, actually leaves a lot of uncertainties here. And I just explained earlier why governments have now chosen to move from pandemic to endemic. That includes Singapore, so that they don't see the economy just blowing out. People have to survive. Economic contractions and slowdowns caused by lockdowns and disruptions to economic activities, including supply chains. That's an area we've done well. The case of Malaysia, because in fact, I was in the Dato Sri Mustafa Mohamad's advisory team in the early stage when the early 2 budgets were launched in 2020. But for some reason, we did not do the same sort of work in freeing logistics. And in this case, it's easier to free logistics because the infrastructure is there, and therefore we have built up exports to the point where we've done better than many other countries, so much so that we have a surplus, trade surplus that's been growing unprecedented in history, and at the same time allowing us to build the international reserves. But we didn't do the same thing for food, though, because it involves a lot more persuasive work, a lot more hard work, because those structures didn't exist in a situation where you will have social distancing from the lockdowns. Economic contraction to slowdowns caused by, a prediction of V-shaped recovery and W-shaped economic recovery, the type that the IMF and the World Bank have been coming up with, because they are often bullish in their notion that whenever there is a crisis, whenever you have a bearish run, a downswing, you will surely have a recovery somewhere. But they're clouded by the surges of in COVID-19 cases, and that's to the point where the chief economists of both institutions have acknowledged that this is a very elusive crisis that we're facing, so much so that we can't really see clearly the site of whether a recovery is indeed taking place. Although, of course, each time government budgets seem to suggest we will have a recovery, we'll have economic growth revived, and we will have unemployment falling to some extent with an initiative to contain inflation. Then you all of a sudden see the Russia-Ukraine war that broke out in February 24, but I think some of them were quite aware that Russia was just waiting for the Winter Olympics to finish, not to displease China. The war between Russia and Ukraine, backed by the US and its NATO allies, threatens to prolong the stagnation. Now, we are coming into a period of stagnation now. I will discuss that in more detail afterwards. But of course, stagnation actually refers to a situation where you have both inflation and stagnation. Unlike the typical economic relationships that as economists, we call the Phillips curve, which talks about an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Now, when you have both going up, you call that stagflation. Economic sanctions by the US and NATO members and allies against Russia, I think they are actually the main cause now why we are suddenly seeing huge shortages in food, why inflation is actually soaring, which actually had started largely because oil prices rose in 2021, unlike in 2020 when oil prices fell so much. It was more expensive to store oil in the ships than to pay money to people for them to buy the oil. That's what happened to clear the glut that was around. ASEAN's position on Russia-Ukraine war, we'll deal with that in one of the sections, and then we'll see the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I would rather look at it more from the perspective of economic sanctions and explain why I take that position. The initial notion, the point that I wanted to make here is there is virtually no relationship to show between affluent countries, middle-income countries, meaning developed countries, middle-income countries, and the least developed countries, as measured by per capita incomes and COVID cases and deaths. I will show you the figure subsequently. So this notion of having this V and subsequently W-shaped recovery, initially the focus was on a V-shaped recoveries. In fact, most mainstream economists were predicting that, so much so that because you had a decline, the growth rate from a lower base would actually show higher growth rates because you have a contraction earlier and therefore the base, the denominator falls. When you compute growth rate for the subsequent year, you'll obviously see a much higher growth rate to take account of that contraction. I already explained why the pandemic is making recovery extremely difficult. Just as when countries are confident that there is a slide, the decline, and that you can then reopen the economy, you see another mutation coming up, and then it causes a surge. Figures 1 and 2 show you cases and deaths by countries since the pandemic struck. I will come back to that. And then, of course, the reason why I'm putting them up is it just looks too elusive. It just looks impossible to contain COVID-19 pandemic because of the mutations. And the scientists are not really giving us any clear picture. In fact, we even worried now whether we should take our second booster with the fourth injection. There's just equal representation of people articulating that they're all experts in science, one arguing over stopping further injections while the other claiming that we need to take account of the new mutations and therefore you need more and more of those injections. And then, of course, I will why governments have made a decision to move from the pandemic to endemic. I mean, it's like looking at people starving slowly or seeing businesses vanish, or for that matter, sectors of the economy ailing, especially in countries like Germany, where the focus was ensuring that the people were not going to suffer as much. So real wages really didn't really fall, and the moratorium that they had, and that actually also meant that banks there weren't making windfall profits. In the case of Japan, they were having real falls in negative profits. In that sense, they were having losses simply because of the fact that they had negative inflation. I mean, value given by real interest rates. Once you adjust nominal interest rates with inflation, you add that together. Japan faced negative interest rates. We didn't face that situation because of the nature of governance here. Banks were still making money, and of course, I was speaking the other day to the banks, and except for perhaps the Islamic Bank, many others sounded like they weren't happy with the fact that the kind of profits they were earning earlier were no longer achievable during the moratorium. My argument then was that, these are the guys who give you the profits, see that they survive, so that your long-term returns will remain, rather than seeing that contract over the long run. Recovery initiatives of all countries have remained bearish, despite bullish predictions by the IMF and the World Bank. This you need to take into account, even though some countries like China sometimes shows positive growth rates, but they have not gone back to the previous growth rates pre the pandemic. Now, the issue now really is confronting economic recovery in the face of continued uncertainty. And this is the two graphs I put there. That is really the explanatory power of this simple two-way regression is virtually zero, R-squared, which means to say the scatter doesn't explain any relationship whatsoever between whether a country is developed, high per capita incomes, the ones right at the end on the x-axis, and the ones having high, both are in logarithmic figures, so that the elastic change in that can be considered to be elasticities, but only if you have high explanatory power. But those T ratios, they're actually significant in the interest of space. I didn't put them there. This is for infections or cases per million people against GDP per capita, both in logarithmic figures. And then this one, it's also explanatory power close to zero, and there's nothing that you can see in terms of relationship, even though I put a line over there, but that's nothing there, telling you how elusive this crisis is, even if we included, which I did, an intervening variable like testing. Some people thought that if we had tested them earlier, and countries would have taken care of them, and therefore the spread would be much less. There's no such thing as that in the way I looked at it statistically. Now we go on to the economic impact of the Russia-Ukraine war. Economic sanctions imposed by the US and its NATO allies. You have to take certain things into consideration. The US has actually come up with this policy long ago, and it continued with the policy looking for regime change in North Korea, in Iran, and in Venezuela. They have not succeeded. Just imagine these countries are that much smaller compared to Russia, and that the same sort of impression that we get that they are looking for regime change. They're telling the Russians to go against the president too, but it's just like those small economies have defied all these sanctions. They still seem to be surviving, although life may not be as easy as it could have been without those sanctions. But Russia is a big economy, and it's also an economy that suggests that it's the effect of this sanction, at least at this moment, it seems like it's boomeranging on the US and its NATO allies, and I'll tell you why. Within ASEAN, while condemning the Russia-Ukraine war, except for Singapore, no other ASEAN member has embarked on imposing economic sanctions on trade and investment involving Russia. None of them have done that. Only Singapore has done that. Initial impact of the war and sanctions drove the ruble down, with Biden claiming that the ruble will eventually be turned into a ruble. But I can tell you, although the figures there, mine comes only until early April, but you will find that the ruble now has reached the second highest level it ever achieved against the euro. That's the figure yesterday. However, the ruble has recovered and is around the same value as it was before its fall. And this, because I got that figure on April 9. Russian exports dominated by essentials such as oil and gas, wheat, fertilizer to grow wheat. In fact, England is facing serious shortage of fertilizers, prices of fertilizer soaring, and China being the other big exporter. And of course, the US has had sanctions with tariffs and so on China from 2017 when Donald Trump became president. Russia's insistence on the use of the ruble in trade transactions actually clouds this whole affair because Russia made it clear that to Germany, for example, you want to buy oil and gas, fine, but you pay us in ruble. And that is a major reason why the ruble hasn't really fallen since its initial fall. It's rising again. Because the sanctions would mean Russia wouldn't have to pay very much to foreign countries because it would not have that much of imports, while there are necessities in countries like Germany that import something like 65% of its oil and gas. It has no choice. And I'll also mention later to you how third countries are playing roles for the US to bypass its sanctions on Venezuela so that it's actually helping its allies with Venezuelan oil, which is transferred. This was the lecture by Jeffrey Sachs the other day in high seas. And then you have the case of oil palm. There's another item that was actually prohibited in Europe for two reasons. One, deforestation, the claim because Europe arguably seen as the most greening sort of nation. Grouping. Then you also have the fact that it's considered an oil that's not really good for health. That's the sort of lobby that they had for a long time, which was affecting our oil palm exports. But now it's going through third countries. Back to them, because I'll explain to you why. Excuse me. Given Russia's economic past and its friendship with large economies of China and India, isolation seems to only recreate, I think, the Iron Curtain of the past, but with changed circumstances. No longer the complete Iron Curtain that we saw, which began with its unraveling started with the East Germany falling in 1991 and then followed by the rest. We have a combined Germany now. This is a situation with the exchange rate. The war started on February 24, then suddenly you see the ruble against the dollar falling. And then by March 12, it's already going up. And then against at least half with euro, it has actually gone higher than what it was before. I haven't seen the statistics, but I believe it will be the same with the US dollar. This is the case with the ruble against the euro. And the same pattern you see, except that I have more information now. The rates that it enjoyed on 25th of April, it's even higher than the euro that we saw over the last 2 years. A rise of inflation and unemployment. We are seeing an extension of stagflation. That's what I see. I mentioned to you, it refers to a situation where the Phillips curve, the relationship between inflation and unemployment, supposedly supposed to be inverse, completely breaks out. It's a situation we faced in the early 70s very distinctly after the US withdrew this is before the US withdrew the US dollar from the gold bullion when we had the fixed exchange rate mechanism then. The world has seen higher inflation and unemployment rates in the past than in 2019 and 2022. Although figures 5 and 6 only come to 2020, but I can extend that with some countries at least where I have information. Inflation fell considerably in 2019 to 2020 at a sharp fall in oil and gas prices insulated price hikes from food shortages caused by lockdowns. As I did mention to you earlier that tankers were actually, those guys shipping oil were actually selling the oil because the storage costs of having those tankers parked at harbors were more expensive than just paying those oil off. That's how low oil prices had fallen. However, since oil and gas prices led to rising inflation since 2021, we have considerable rise. Of course, Malaysia is also a beneficiary because we are a net oil exporter. Significant amount of our export revenue comes from oil and gas. Therefore, we benefit from that. And somehow there is this logic that, well, we are losing money because of the subsidy given to RON 95 because of the poor. It's true they're giving a subsidy, but they are enjoying a net benefit. And therefore, on balance, they are not really losing anything as such. If we have a question, I can give you my clarification for it. In fact, we are not even, we are supposed to be, Petronas is supposed to be giving money to KWAN, where that's the Natural Resource Act that was started in 1988. And of course, it's supposed to, I don't know whether this is true, but Tunku Rozali mentioned that they've been giving annually 30 billion ringgit to government. UMNO in particular, he used UMNO rather than government. While unemployment stayed steady among the low and middle income countries, it's difficult to show scatter plots in one of two diagrams. And given the fact that the presentation is short, I can't possibly have too much of details. And therefore, I've just aggregated the figures for high income economies, middle income economies, and low income economies in the subsequent figures. Economic sanctions more than the Russia-Ukraine war is threatening a rise in stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment occurring at the same time all over the world. And you will see when I come to the experience of ASEAN, I wanted to give that experience subsequently. This is the inflation by income levels. This is by broad categories. Low income, strict definition, per capita income less than 1,000 US. And then you have the middle income, which has got both the lower and upper middle income. Malaysia is an upper middle income country, just like Mexico. And then high income economies in Asia, not just Japan, but also Republic of Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. Now, if you look at it, the figure here comes, this is for low income countries, and we are dealing with inflation by income levels. The inflation already started in 2021. Inflation already started, which is not here. For low-income countries, it's been going up from something like 2019. For middle-income countries, it was falling, including Malaysia. But it's gone up again. We'll see the specific figures later. High-income countries, it fell in 2020. These figures come until 2020. And then, but it's been rising. It has been rising since. This is unemployment by income levels. Again, low-income country. This shows the rise in unemployment in all three categories of countries overall. But in the case of ASEAN, unemployment levels were actually falling in 2021, but they are rising again. This set of figures come from the World Bank, World Development Indicators, so we don't have other data as such, but I expect unemployment to be rising again now, given the fact that you have huge shortages in a number of essentials, which has had a ripple effect on demand. Because of that, you have labor shedding. Economic impact on ASEAN countries. We focus on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war on two critical macroeconomic variables among the founding ASEAN countries and Vietnam. I didn't want to bring Brunei in. I'm not sure how much we can learn from Brunei there. And I suppose I also didn't think that Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar will be very relevant here, but I thought Vietnam, especially so when some economic agents as well as authorities in Malaysia are concerned about the rise of Vietnam. Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam faced low inflation in 2020, owing to sharply fallen oil and gas prices. This is the point I made. This is by country I have out there afterwards. However, unemployment rose in all these countries in 2020, but fell slightly in 2021. Unemployment rose because you have all these lockdowns and firms closing down, losing money, and some of them having much less employment because of the social distancing that was required. Economic sanctions imposed by the US and NATO are likely to reverse unemployment levels to rise again. This is because I was saying the unemployment levels in 2021 was falling. Even though inflation was rising, unemployment levels were falling, followed the typical Phillips curve sort of notion and the inverse relationship. But this set of economic sanctions are now actually reversing that back and causing, and there are lots of articles already now about that stagflation is imminent. I think it's already there. Normally, the pickup in statistics will follow after those events. Food shortages and a fall in trade is expected to exacerbate inflation so as to cause a rise in stagflation. This is the case with Indonesia. You see, of course, I have a longer series here between 91 and 2020. 2020 right here. You see inflation having fallen in 2020, but the figures that you will get from Indonesian sources would show a rise in inflation there. In the case of unemployment, you see unemployment rising, slightly rising in 2020, but it's got worse subsequently. In the case of Malaysia, you see inflation having fallen tangibly, in fact, from 2017 to 2018, 2019, and 2020 as well. But inflation has since risen. If you look at the new statistics, monthly statistics, it has actually risen. In the case of unemployment, it rose in 2020, fell actually in 2021, and it's rising again. Philippines is a similar sort of situation, except that inflation had a different sort of pattern, unemployment, a similar sort of pattern. In the case of Singapore here, Singapore has had a sharp fall in inflation. It's into a deflationary state where the general level of prices actually contracted rather than slowing down. And in the case of unemployment, it rose. It also fell in 21, but it's rising again if you get individual country source data. Thailand has a similar sort of situation. You have had a fall. In fact, it's deflationary. It was deflationary already in 2020. And then, of course, the inflation in 2021 was already rising, and it's actually above zero so far in the last few months. This is the case of Vietnam, which doesn't show much of a change, except that because it had a very high inflation rate, this was really the attempt for the economy getting monetized from the earlier social structures that actually led to prices soaring at a time. So it doesn't really show very much the real economy. We should focus on this, but not much is happening here. Now, are we concerned? Because I saw in the newspapers that some guys are claiming they will be the next Sri Lanka, on the grounds that we had a corrupt state there, where families took charge of things, and then they somehow relaxed taxation and so on and so forth, so that the revenue they still could have. This was largely to, in inverted commas, to buy the elections, and of course then getting involved in rentiering businesses, which has led to the collapse of Sri Lanka. Of course, you had a situation of a huge blowout in their international reserves. In fact, it had no money to pay back. That's the main role of the IMF. When creditors no longer give you money and you can't service your debt, at the same time pay for your imbalances in the balance of payment accounts and similar other claims, then you will have to call the IMF. The IMF, of course, will only release these funds through what it would refer to as structural adjustment package, which many others call as shock therapy, because they would make the argument that you guys have been bursting at the seams, over-consuming, and therefore you have to float your currency, let it crash so that imports would go down. And at the same time, you should raise interest rates in order to see that there's not much liquidity out there, and that it's highly sterilized from risky operations. Pakistan is also facing that from the IMF. Now, I wouldn't say our ASEAN countries are in that situation. I'll explain to you why. But I don't have the kind of time series data for many other countries, like, for example, debt service ratios I had for Philippines, but I don't have it for Malaysia. The World Bank doesn't carry that. And because this assignment came too late, I didn't have time to check with the World Bank, Bank Negara. So is the case with the non-performing loans. These are the three main ones that are typically used to look at whether a country is getting exposed and likely to face a collapse, balance and payment crisis, and so on, and on the brink of making sure that it had to go to some sort of last resort lender. But I do have figures on international reserves, the amount that you have that can pay for months of exports. By rule of thumb, any ratio of reserves above 5 months of imports is considered good. It's considered good. Figure 13 shows that the reserves in months of imports. So it's an error that you just have to change that to imports. Of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, they actually rose. Vietnam had its second peak. The earlier peak was in 2007. Its second peak of around four times, although it's less than 5. And in the case of Philippines, exceeded 12 times for a country that was under the reign of the IMF. The last time being up to the 97-98 Asian financial crisis. The exceptionally high international reserves has translated into strong rise in the peso, while the other currencies have stayed steady, though there has been a slight fall in the baht and the dong. Of course, against the Sing dollar, I suppose the ringgit has fallen, but one will check that after that. In the interest of time, I just use the US dollar. And of course, we can do it as a composite aggregate. In fact, if we only had the real effective exchange rate, but I didn't see those figures in the last World Development Report. As with the rest of the world, economic sanctions on Russia primarily, and to some extent on China, because China is also a major exporter of fertilizers, will have a contagion effect on ASEAN countries soon. You would have some sort of contagion, not just following the Singapore path of accepting what America tells. Hence, despite surging international reserves, these countries are also expected to face stagflation over this year, although the figures are not showing up in clear terms. Nevertheless, because these statistics show that the ASEAN countries enjoy strong external macroeconomic fundamentals, the reserves are high. The evidence shows that the external economy of these countries will remain positive over the rest of 2022. So that would mean that countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, and as well as China, Thailand, would not have to say go with the cap in hand to the IMF for loans because they don't have that exposure problem. Malaysia was lucky because most of our debt in 97, 98 were denominated in the local currency, just like when the US imploded in the year 2007, 2008. Currency transactions were in the US. One of the things the US did, as what Paul Krugman mentions in his book, was to just print the US dollar. So whoever had reserves in the US dollar, the actual value fell. And once the debt is denominated in local currency, it's not a problem. There are no creditors out there. The central bank can actually print, except that if you have too much of a disjuncture between the real economy and the financial economy, you will see a bubble. And if it grows, the bubble eventually will burst, though, which is the case with the Korean economy, the Filipino economy, Thai economy, and Indonesia during the 97-98 crisis, or the US in 2007-2008 crisis. In fact, their management of the system also affected, made the bubble grow bigger. In the case of the US, when inflation was rising because oil prices were rising, exceeded even $100 a barrel, they actually tried to contain inflation. When Ben Bernanke took over the Fed chief from Alan Greenspan, he raised interest rates from 0.5% to 5.5% at its height. It actually affected different parts of the economy. The housewives, all sorts of people who borrowed money either to buy a house or to buy cars and so on, they went bust. And that actually precipitated the crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis. And of course, the nature of how the US governance also became too lax, in the sense that Greenspan made the point that unless you leave markets to make decisions, then innovations that come with the financial system cannot be realized because the regulators are always backward in time. I mean, they're not ahead in time. They're too far back to allow such innovations. So you had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac allowing Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and others to just accept all sorts of I would say, nonsense, which led to a lot of closures then. This is the case with total reserves in months of imports, which is a better measure rather than the actual reserves. Malaysia's is around 107 billion US ringgit now, US dollars, sorry. And it's been rising over the last several years. It's been rising, especially during the COVID. It's risen even faster, simply because we resumed exports with immediate. I'm not sure whether end of March or early April. We just lifted all these restrictions on logistics. But then again, we didn't do the same thing because the infrastructure involving the small farmers who bring food to markets and so on, a lot of them didn't really enjoy that sort of connectivity and coordination. In fact, when I thought the parliament was closing, they could have done that too, meaning that the military could have done the job of transporting that to markets for them. But obviously that didn't happen. The reasons were something to do with the parliament, with politics. But here you see the rise. There's a trend rise. Of course, in between there's been a fall. Like Indonesia, there was a slight fall below the 5 times, but then the trend has been rising from about 2012, 2013. And in the case, this is Indonesia, sorry. And then you have Thailand over here, also up there, and then you have Philippines. Philippines, which has got over 12 times, more than 12 times. Then you have Thailand, and then the lowest here is Vietnam. But Vietnam's peak here is about the peak it ever had from the time the statistics starts. So it's got a rich set of reserve in US dollars, unless the dollar falls, like during when the US withdrew the US dollar from the gold billion in 1971 when in the Vietnam War. Then these countries are somewhat secure, I would say, in relation to exposure. This is the exchange rates you can see. But the figures here from the World Bank, you only have until 2020. We only have until 2020. Even though we had a serious fall in the ringgit between 97, June 97, until we pegged with the 3.8 ringgit to a dollar by November. I think generally it's been much more gentle than the other countries. But they're rising in value. They're rising in value, except that in the case of Philippines, there's been a slight fall here, but it's been rising since we checked. They're rising again. But I wouldn't look at currencies as much compared to, say, reserves in relation to months of imports, which to me is a much more important figure, and the debt service ratio. Conclusions that I will draw, and of course I've spoken in general terms. I'm not really focusing much on Malaysia, but I'll be happy to address questions if they're focused on any one of related issues. The impact on the world from the COVID-19 pandemic has remained uncertain, despite the shift in many countries from the pandemic to the endemic. COVID cases and deaths have surged again in a number of countries, which has left the economic future, most countries, still grim. The unnecessary Russia-Ukraine war, I mean, it's claimed a lot of lives. No one can justify the war in that sense, has indeed been a negative distraction. But the economic sanctions by the US and its NATO allies have deepened the deflation in the stagflation that emerged from 2021. With rising inflation and unemployment, ASEAN and Malaysian national economies are not expected to achieve the bullish growth predictions others have made. Yes, in particular, 6 months ago, the predictions made, say, by the World Bank and the IMF. However, because the international reserves of all ASEAN countries have continued to improve since 2020, they show strengthening of external macroeconomic fundamentals that will insulate them from externally driven crises. So these countries are unlikely to face the same fate as Sri Lanka. Also, the East Asian economies have tightened their financial instruments that they are unlikely to face the external exposure, debt service, foreign debt service problems, balance of payment deficits, and burgeoning non-performing loans, the type South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia encountered in 97-98. This was clear during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis that hit us. US was a year earlier. Our NPLs were all well in order. A key issue ASEAN countries must address, though, is the need to raise self-sufficiency levels in essential goods, especially food, check inflation, affecting the poor. Efforts that go in that direction should also offer the opportunity to create jobs and to control unemployment. A country that has done well there, I must say, is Taiwan. It has brought back significant parts of manufacturing through robotization. It's brought back significant parts of agriculture through both the introduction of robots and drones, so much so that its rice self-sufficiency is 93%, and every other horticultural product not less than 80%. Malaysia, I just would like to stop just after mentioning one point. We actually import 70% of our chilies now. Self-sufficiency for chilies is 30%. With that, I'll stop there. Thank you. I hope I was audible enough.
Thank you, Professor, for that concise presentation. I will now open the floor to questions. You can unmute yourself and ask a question, or alternatively, you can also write your questions in the chat box, and we will address it from there.
I'm not sure if anyone attended the lecture this morning by Tan Sri Kamal, which I moderated.
We didn't on our side. I'm not sure about the rest.
Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Raja. Wan Rusli here from EPF.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, just a quick one on China. With their zero COVID measures that has basically impacted the economy quite badly. Eventually the Premier has come up with a program of pumping infra to pump back the economy. Do you reckon this measure that they are doing now is sufficient enough for them to see an improved economic activity moving forward? Like to have your view on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, one important advantage. I mean, of course, it's got several advantages. But one important advantage I'd like to flag with China is that, I mean, in contrast to the notion expounded by Darren Acemoglu and David Robinson in their book Why Nations Fail, China is actually not totally a centrally planned economy. It's been marketizing, having reforms since 1978, so much so that on the one hand, it has control, tremendous control to shift a huge dinosaur from one side to another, something more democratic states cannot or don't enjoy. But at the same time, it's quite well informed in the sense that what happens in China, particularly from the late 90s, not so much when reforms first started, is the coordination that they have between central planning, the intermediation by provinces, connecting with the municipalities and the counties, such that information, the plans are drawn first, goes through the provinces, but it gets to the municipalities and counties. Then there's back and forth movement of information, of agreements, a whole range of other things, such that by the time decisions are made to launch a policy, that coordination is there. And it's a smooth collective coordination where there's not much disjuncture between one and another. And the second thing is the attempt to marketize also means that they, to my extent at least, I have a book written with a student of mine. It's called Institutionalization of State Policy, Evolving Urban Housing Reforms by Springer, 2015. Now, they use this Confucian approach that they are ready to change when the things are not working. When they're crossing a stream, is a Confucian statement. They look for all these shallow spaces so that you find the right track to cross the stream. That's really a Confucian statement. But in that point, they are ready to change when things don't work. And there are many examples when we quote in that book, when things don't work, and again, it's through lots of discussion at the county level and at the municipal level, they are ready to change. They are ready to change what doesn't work. In fact, that was the case when Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao Zedong. Even though Deng Xiaoping was fired earlier, this is now we have Xi Jinping. Now, that was the case that he could end up implementing things that he felt wasn't working. An example I can mention to you is, during Mao Zedong's time, it was like the Soviet Russia. People worked for joy and so on, and then based on needs, the rewards were distributed. But from Deng Xiaoping, there were rewards. So the impression, I mean, at that time I didn't know, but reading all these works that are more China-centric gave me the impression that there was a reward for effort subsequently. So that was a significant change from the time of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. There was a significant change, learning from mistakes. Things that actually I believe, if you read the work of Michael Ellman and Alexander Kantorowicz, he was a Nobel laureate, The Decline of the Soviet Economy, that's a book that he wrote. Apparently, Lenin had actually recognized that, but he couldn't make any change because Stalin had become too powerful then. So coming back to this point here, I think they've been testing on a number of approaches. The zero COVID approach, it's not necessarily one they will always follow through, but they have been handling it in such a way that they have still, in relation to their population, one of the best records for both cases and deaths, and especially so when a lot of people believe Wuhan is the epicenter of this whole crisis. Now, I'm not saying it is, because I am still not absolutely sure whether that's indeed the case, but that's something I would like to make. So I think China, and they're also handling the kind of restrictions Chinese firms face. For example, the prohibition of the sale of semiconductor chips by even Taiwanese firms like TSMC to Huawei. Of course, it doesn't go directly to Huawei, but through its subsidiary HiSilicon that assembles, because TSMC only does the fabrication. So I don't think this thing suggests that they are rigid, meaning the zero COVID policy as a rigid instrument. And even if so, I think it's easier to implement there the kind of coordination China enjoys. It's easier to administer it there than you could possibly administer in Malaysia or Indonesia.
So you reckon the pump timing that the Premier just announced yesterday or 2 days ago will be basically a growth factor for China moving forward?
Yes, China hasn't abandoned that. In fact, I can tell you that the way I have seen Chinese shifts, especially since of course, you can see major shifts from the time you look at the whole scenario after Deng Xiaoping, which is much earlier, took over from Mao Zedong. My impressions of it is there's been dramatic changes in their policy shifts to address the uncertainty that you have in the world. For example, the attempt to build infrastructure in central and western China. It was largely a solution to crash in exports when the global financial crisis took place. So that the steel and so on that they were exporting went there to build to take care of those fallen demand. Likewise, the Belt and Road Initiative that they proposed, it's to build new markets, because they saw as they got closer, became more and more competitive to the countries above them. It wasn't easy. So I saw the initiative, and it looks like an interesting initiative because on the one hand, the US and Europe had actually reduced aid to the African countries because most of them were defaulting. Nigeria defaulted at least twice, and many others were defaulting, and they weren't very much interested in giving aid. China went around on a big scale, but again focused on infrastructure development. Of course, the Western agenda is to make the claim that yeah, they're going to bankrupt these countries to take control of them.
Professor, we've lost you there. Can't hear you.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. If you could, if you could put the mic slightly nearer.
Yeah, I don't have an external mic. I mean, it'll be too late now to add another device, but I hope I'm audible enough now. I speak closer to the
Yes, you are.
the
Thanks.
computer system. Okay. So in other words, what I'm saying here is their planning seems to be very long term, and they have plan B, plan C, and so on. They're waiting in case things don't work. Of course, when you're dealing with uncertainty, I do not think that countries can be lucky enough to expect that there won't be any cost. No, but the question is whether there is a plan that is superior, or whether you can recalibrate your strategies very quickly to address the various different random things that happen. How well you plan with foresight, you cannot possibly plan completely so that there's no crisis of any kind. No, it's just like in 2004, I remember the Nobel laureate, Bob Lucas, along with this guy, Ben Bernanke, who took over from Alan Greenspan, making the point that the world had learned enough. There will not be any crisis anymore. They made that statement. Just as the statement was made, 3 years from then, you had the U.S. economy, arguably the most mature economy, imploded. So I think what I'm saying here is we assured that the nature of how the various different capitalisms have evolved, unlike what Francis Fukuyama claimed in his book, The End of History, I think we will have other forms of crisis. But China, I think, seems to have demonstrated the capacity to handle them better than many other countries.
Thank you, Radha.
You're welcome. I hope I haven't scared anyone away or distracted.
Dr. Raja, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I have two questions actually. So, in your opinion, what Russia economically and politically they are trying to achieve from the whole invasion? And the second one, again, in your opinion, what is the worst thing that could ever happen from the invasion itself? Because right now we are seeing commodity prices goes up, the sanctions that is worsening the supply chains network, supply chain net flows. So in your opinion, what is the worst thing that could ever happen from this whole situation? That's it. Thanks.
I'm not an expert on international relations, but I've always enjoyed listening to speakers from that sort of field because they are always sure about what they say. As an economist, I tend to feel that this is sort of information I have, and then therefore it allows me to say these things. But I'm ready to accept that I don't have the whole picture, and therefore I could be wrong. But coming to this question that you posed, I've read different accounts of it. I think the purpose, the cost of Russia's involvement in this war has very little to do with economics, my own feeling. Because if you look at how with Glasnost and Perestroika, when Gorbachev came to the West to say, well, our experiment has failed, when the Soviet Union fell, they had followed the promise that they made that they would close down the Warsaw Pact. All these countries that they've lived up to it. But what I think Putin, I'm looking at what Putin is claiming. Putin's point, of course, between them you had Boris Yeltsin, who probably gambled away many things against Russia. But the important thing to recognize is that these countries that were freed, almost all of them have joined NATO. Almost all of them have joined NATO. And in this case, with Ukraine, the Putin's argument is there's a lot of Russians there. I mean, the entire emphasis now on Eastern Ukraine. There are a lot of Russians there, and they are actually have lots of mercenary forces and so on. And the initial attempt to shoot down various parts near Kiev and so on, I've been to Kiev myself, was to actually weaken the aerial capacity of the Ukrainians. And of course, as now Russia has already released information that over the last few years, the US was helping Ukraine build biological and chemical weapons. Now, my own feeling is as far as economics is concerned, I'm not sure, although Ukraine is an important exporter of sunflower seed oil, rapeseed oil, wheat, it is the second largest country in Europe after Russia, excluding Siberia, which is in Asia. Russia is still the largest. And in that sort of sense, my own feeling is whatever Ukraine has, of course, Ukraine also has certain sorts of minerals that are important in producing nuclear bombs and so on and so forth. But still, if we end up talking about nuclear bombs, then you're still talking about politics more than economics. So my own feeling is the concern, because it had warned Zelensky, who came to power through a coup with U.S. support in 2014. So you can see, I mean, the guys who argue against the NATO allies make the claim that we don't look at the way, say, Mossadegh was removed in Iran, the way the attempt to remove, for example, the leadership in that time was Hugo Chavez in Chile, not Chile, Venezuela, or for that matter, Fidel Castro in Cuba. Now the point being made here is that argument takes the point that it's an attempt to destabilize, to retain only one superpower. Now, coming to your second point, I'll do that very quickly. The second point, what does Russia aim to achieve? My own point is it will probably take, and just like Crimea. Crimea actually was lost to Ukraine through a gamble by Khrushchev, I think, a long time ago. It took Crimea in 2014, I think. It captured Crimea, which is in the Black Sea. Now, it once part of eastern Ukraine, where there are lots of Russians. And at the same time, it wants to have control over what happens in Ukraine, because they are at the heart. It's like Russia being in Mexico, waiting to bomb, say, Texas or California. So my own feeling is that, and of course I cannot, my level of conjecturing is constrained because I'm not a military expert. Thank you.
Professor, we have got a question on the chat room from Ahmad Aiman. Are we entering a new era for inflation and interest rate?
Oh, there are many more questions. Okay, I'll answer that one first. As I mentioned, I'm expecting, and I think it's imminent in some countries are already being felt, including the developed countries like the UK. Inflation inflation is rising. Unemployment is also rising. Now, if the central bank, the Chancellor of Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, if he decides to raise interest rates to contain inflation, it will have the same effect as what Bernanke was doing in the US when he raised interest rates, because he raised interest rates to contain inflation. The whole economy imploded. So you have a situation where when stagflation comes about, you can't use that strategy, which is often used because of the typical Philip-shaped relationship, which is inverse between inflation and employment. So my impressions, again, it depends on the countries involved. UK is facing quite a serious situation, including serious shortages in fertilizer for their wheat farming and a number of things. People just jump. Prime ministers make a decision, they jump into the war, a sea of war, and they're not realizing that there could be sharks here and sharks there. There could be areas where there are places that are shallow, without really taking account of so many of these things. And UK is not the US. The US is a huge economy. Its reliance on abroad is much less because it's about 20% imports and exports in GDP of US. So it's really an economy that's driven internally. Most large countries are like that. UK is not the same though, although Malaysia, Singapore, and so on, higher reliance in that sort of sense. Now again, it depends on whether we will raise interest rates now because inflation is rising. My own take will be we could possibly have. Again, I don't know if the central bank would do what it did in 97, 98. In 97, 98, it had certain lowered interest rates portfolios for SMEs in order to see that those SMEs that have gone down or ailing could be supported. I would actually prefer, in that sort of sense, in a circumstance like this, that a moratorium, even if given, or subsidized interest is given. Korea has done it before. Done selectively, and to those groups that actually require it, so that we don't burn our treasury. That would be my suggestion. But to think of interest rate being raised, that's the typical instrument macroeconomists seem to have used in the past, and there are clear cases that has failed. The case of the US, I gave you the most mature economy in the world. Now, the next question is, how badly is the Russia-Ukraine war expected to impact on the Chinese economy? China is already having resurgence of COVID cases and potentially facing lockdowns in more cities. Yeah, the second part of it is happening, but China is relatively friendly to the US, to Russia, to the extent where I was told Russia state only attacked Ukraine after the Winter Olympics because of China. Now, my own feeling is the COVID case itself is not directly going to get either negative or a positive impact from this war. And of course, if you tie economic sanctions, yeah, it seems it will have an impact on countries that are hard done, that require aid to support their health systems, for example. In our case, we took, I think, some money from Kwan, but still we have huge amount of international reserves, which has been growing. In fact, I don't think it was necessary because our international reserves come to 7 months of imports. You just need 5 months to be safe, and they didn't have to go and get this money to buy vaccines and so on from Kwan. But I think my own feeling is if you're dealing with China, I think because at the same time the US is considering how much they should tighten on China, because it's impossible for the US and NATO allies to take both of them together, although to some extent they are taking them together, which is impacting them in some ways, though. China has also been quite selective in making decisions on fertilizer exports. China and Russia export cheap fertilizers, which are central to farming in many of these countries. So my own feeling is, while the surge has nothing to do with economics, my own feeling is that the scientists should be speaking about it. We should see how the mutations can be ended. But it's unfortunate it's unfortunate that we haven't had a clear sign of the mutations ending. But at the same time, we can also make the point. That if any country are capable of handling this, I think China is the best place. Now, the next question: Malaysia imports nearly 60% of its food needs. Of course, this is indeed it's a very important question. I actually I convinced when I was speaking to the banks, and we were speaking from the Islamic Bank, Bank of Islam, where Dr. Afzal Nizam was there, moderating the session, that our food account, this is the current account, food current account, has been in the negative from 1989. I mean, our current account itself from trade, from 1989 till the time the financial crisis struck, was negative. The ringgit rose because of the capital account, with lots of portfolio equity investments and foreign direct investment that actually inflated the exchange rate, which was actually bad for the economy because it actually burnt food farming. One of the reasons why food farming got burnt, and that because imports became very cheap when the ringgit went up to 2.4 ringgit to a dollar, and then gradually, when the crisis struck, I think it was about 2 ringgit and 70 cents, but still a lot cheaper than what it is now. Now, talking about that, I think this is an area that there must be a lot of focus. Now, food items follow. In economics, some of the things I like about economics, although I only did a PhD in economics, I was a business management student first degree, it tells you about how a good functions in the economy. A public good is non-excludable, non-rivalrous. Whatever happens somewhere, others have to feel, like climate change or the haze we got from Sumatra, for example. If only you can have some sort of a beam that could control it, everybody becomes, whoever doesn't spend also will become a free rider there to use it. It's just like now we have all the subsidies that have been introduced, but because food is an essential good or a given good, we call it inferior good, reasonable change in price will consume the same amount. So there's a whole lot of leakage, not just leakage going through the borders to Thailand, to Singapore through the ships. I'm not sure, maybe Singapore, they are better in controlling smuggling, but Indonesia, all this rampant this thing happens. Now, it also, the free riders include the tourists who come here. You wouldn't face the same situation, say, in the Nordic countries. We all pay wet. We all end up paying wet, and there's a way they have to distribute it to them. Now, because of that, food needs special attention. We had mechanisms to do that in the 70s. There's a book I did edited with Ketan Sri Kamal. It's called Driving Development, Revisiting Malaysia's Economic Progress, Revisiting Razak on Malaysia's economic progress. In the 70s, even though we did not have a great R&D system here, what we did was largely to import technologies, adapted them, like the double cropping from Erie, like the machines from Japan, Kubota and some plowing machines. But we did a great job of ensuring that it actually helped raise price self-sufficiency, which was 87% in 1976, the year Tun Razak left us. I thought it was too soon. Now it's 67% now here. In Taiwan, it's 93%. And the same framework, Taiwan uses that what we did in the 70s. We guarantee a price to the farmer. We supply fertilizer and so on, but tell them exactly what to do. If they don't perform, then we have a system of making sure they perform. In fact, the heads of many of these organizations were changed so that we, productivity, in fact, there we even compute productivity, all that were increasing things that are not happening now. So I think your point is right that we need to focus a lot on food. Largely, if you're making sure that there is no worsening of what we call as kesenjangan, which is inequality. So that has been a major issue earlier on. It's become even more so now.
Thank you, Professor. Any more questions?
The food issue, because I basically abandoned my role in the advisory group because I somehow feel that I need to spend some time to see that my CV is not stagnating. In fact, I could have been in the EPU in the 90s when I was really asked to join them. But it's because I felt that part of it cannot be stopped, and EPU has this rule that you have to be totally there. Now, coming to this point here, the logistics part that was addressed for exporting companies was excellent. I mean, I kept telling them, you are blocking the blood capillaries, the veins, the arteries, and so on. Then people don't get oxygen anymore. That's the sort of thing we're looking at an organism. Now, I actually included the food farmers and so on. And in the case of the food farmers, most of them are small. Not only that we abandoned intensive farming, which is different from extensive farming, since Tun Mahathir became prime minister in the 80s, where we also need to address infrastructure requirements of the small farmer. In fact, I can tell you that a lot of small farmers went out of business because there's no connectivity. That's why I was one of them who initially supported the parliament closure. I thought Darurat would have given them the opportunity to military to handle all these supply disruptions involving, say, the small farmer, involving those disadvantaged people, even those guys who are in Pasar Malam, to all that. So that electronically you can connect them with digitalization and Industry 4.0 technologies. Unfortunately, that was a political act. I didn't realize that the Darurat was going to end up that way. There is another point. How sensitive Malaysia's consumption to inflation? The figures that we have is an aggregation. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, is an aggregation. But it affects some people a lot more than other people. Because if you are, for example, denied a supply of food, if you are located in Lembah Kelang, I mean the Klang Valley, and you have a situation where the markets you go to experience high price rise, then you will see the difference. But the aggregation effect for the whole country may not be visible because it might be much lower elsewhere. And in some cases, there is the general rule in economics that when prices go up, they easily go up. And then they become sticky and not come down once they go up. And that will have some sort of effect. That's why at one panel platform, I actually encourage that we have different measures of inflation, food-based inflation, or even essentials, given goods like rice. You can have that sort of additional figures too, but it may be politically dangerous for governments in power because then it might reflect on on items related to the poor, not showing the sort of change that people want to see to address the real problems of poverty, say. What would be the most efficient way for the government to implement the targeted fuel subsidy program? And how soon do you think we will see it? My own impression about any form of subsidy, that fuel subsidy being one of them, in relation to global prices, because in the relevant sense in terms of what Petronas gives as surplus earnings to the government, for example, it may not be seen as the same, because what is relevant, what is actual, they all have economic differences, because economic value is different from accounting value. It's just like we say air has no price because it's free. There is no competing interest there. It's completely you can exclude it. What would be the most? My impression is we should not provide this as a subsidy that everybody else can enjoy. I myself, and I'm not boasting, I only went to buy RON 97 because I don't want to be part of the RON 95 to enjoy the subsidy. Not that I wanted RON 97. Now, my own impression of it is that should not be a subsidy at that point, because the free riders will be extensive, including the RON that gets smuggled into Kalimantan, which is likely to expand a lot more when Nusantara becomes the capital of Indonesia. Now, my impressions of this is there must be a different mechanism of providing it. The BRIM wasn't a good way of doing it in the past. Why? Because you just gave cash, you don't know what is used from the cash. If you are looking at Norway, they use vouchers. They use vouchers that can only allow you to buy essentials. Essentials, that's all that you can use it for. And you have to be here to buy it. You can't see the actual good going through the borders. Now, of course, if you think that somebody is going to sell that voucher to somebody else, the losses involved will be much less compared to what you have now. The kind of coastline we have, the kind of customs we have, it's impossible to contain all this. So there must be a rule. If it means that the losses will be that much more, even though you catch some small fellows, I think the alternative will be better here. And therefore, my impression is just like you impose a VAT or a GST, the way they do it in Europe. Of course, the UK has a standard VAT. I think it's 22% now. When they started, it was 17%. Now, on all goods, it's the same. But in continental Europe, it varies between a good that is considered important for the environment. It's like if you buy a hybrid car, you pay much less road tax. If you buy an ostentatious good, a car is a luxury in Denmark, 110%. To the point where even beer, for example, I think that the VAT is only 2% in Denmark. We are seen as a working class food. Now, my own feeling is they should have this paid by everybody, but there must be a foolproof way of compensating them. The voucher system, to me, will be the best. But in that process, it's just like, I don't know if you all are aware, Phil Alston. He was the UN rep who criticized our measurement of poverty and our poverty index. He says it's misrepresenting what is happening. Two reasons. One, the poverty line income in 1970 was 50 ringgit. And in 2018, the amount that we call 980 ringgit can only buy the goods and services of that 50 ringgit of 1970. So it's basically an increment based on inflation. That's what happened. Have I crossed the time, Shadida? Sorry.
Just slightly, but there's an interesting question that's just popped up. Can you comment on the relevance of wage growth or the recent minimum wage law impact the recent Malaysia's inflation dynamic?
I think the wage growth now, because of the minimum wage going up to 1,500, I don't think that has had much impact. Because you're looking at wages of only that group of people, and it doesn't even include the informal sector. The main reason why a minimum wage is imposed, and if it is measured through the way the ILO does, is more to ensure that people are not exploited legally. They are not exploited legally. So that you don't have this informal thing, so people can take legal action if you don't pay that sort of wage. And it's the bare minimum. It's not a decent wage. And when you're dealing with this, how many of them would be affected? Those who are earning more than 1,500 will remain with the income that they have, unless the firm decides, which is possible though, because the minimum lowest wage is 1,500, then you can increase the rest of them. But has that been the case? Now, my own feeling is that hasn't been tangible enough to make the difference. But I'm not sure if that's the right amount. I'm not sure that I didn't measure it. I did once a study for Selangor in the Klang Valley. And that was 2012, when we felt that 1,500 would be the bare minimum there. But taking into account a family size with 3 children, and at that time we also had a situation that has really gone bad, because the 2008-2000 financial crisis brought a crash in exports. So our central bank, our Bank Negara Malaysia, was promoting the expansion of domestic consumption, and what they did was to lower interest rates. So household debt exploded. That this is the knee-jerk reaction. I hope these things don't happen. But my own feeling is we need other things to handle real wage rise. In that, I want to make a case that if you look at Taiwan, a whole lot of work that was done by labor is done by robots, drones, machines. We should be harvesting palm oil, for example, using robots. Why? If you look at how that sort of farming is done in Taiwan, I've been there, been on site there. And to the point where the mango orchards, in fact, the mangoes are actually a Pakistani breed. They produce such intensive this thing and export to the US to high prices. Now, my own feeling is, to be very precise on your question, I do not think this, in terms of tracking the price mechanism, that would have been a major influence, because the major push really is the rise in oil prices, its effect on the cascading effect, the domino effect on every other sector that depends on oil, and oil prices are rising. Now we have a situation of food shortages emerging, serious food shortages emerging, and as well as oil and gas too, because it's part of the rise is because of the shortages there. Now, all this to me are more important than the minimum wage. That would be my short answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think I will need to bring this session to a close soon, but I will allow for one more questions if there's any. I think we've covered quite varied areas from the questions. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you for addressing them, Professor.
Thank you.
Any more last question?
Is this the last question?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So is your conclusion that the world will fall into a stagflation? I'm expecting a stagflation, but I don't expect it to last too long, because when people feel the pinch and the pain, then they will start to cooperate more. And in countries that are reluctant to do that, governments will fall. So eventually, I think there will be an attempt to address these problems. I'm not sure how it will happen, but it's like the US, for example. Imagine prices going up. How the housewife, what happens in Ukraine may not matter at all, but it matters if suddenly they have to pay a high interest service rate. They have to pay. They are denied of a reasonable income that would allow them to consume as much they were consuming before. That it can be translated into votes, and before that happens, government would, I think, change the tone in such ways that whoever who then leads may end up accommodating all these changes that are being imposed. Although, of course, that sort of change may be less in the countries like China and Russia because of the nature of regimes that they have there. Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, I think I will have to bring the session to a close already. Professor, thank you so very much for your time and for for sharing your views and also addressing all the questions that have been raised during this session. I would also like to thank Bursa Malaysia for doing this event jointly with us, and also to all participants of this event today. Just to let you know, this session is going to be recorded, and it will be available on Bursa's website. And if you have any questions, Professor, is it okay if
have any other questions
Of course
to
we can, yeah,
contact
yeah.
you at your email. You can get the professor's email address from one of the salesperson, and the slides, it's all right to give to them as well, right, Professor?
Yes, sure.
The presentation. Yeah, okay. You can also get the slides, a copy of the slides, the soft copy from us. So thank you very much, and I hope you take care of yourselves and stay safe. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Same to you. Thanks very much.
All right. Okay. Goodbye.